on this episode of AK Podcast.
I think we've covered a lot of ground already, right? We even started before the calf was born. We spent a lot of time talking about the milk fed period and some of the risks and opportunities there. I started to touch on grain, and then we kind of teed this thing up right to dive into the weaning process, and we talked about that a little bit last time. But I think the lifetime impact on weaning a calf, whether you do it right or wrong, is so profound and so long-lived that it's worth spending a little bit of extra time diving into that, making sure we give it the time it deserves.
You know you're a hay nerd when you walk into a hay barn and you just love that smell.
Doggone it, I got to put more corn in. I'm going to have to add some soybean meal. Wow, did that cost you a lot of money?
Put yourself in a crowded elevator, and the elevator stops because, I don't know, the building's on fire.
I really like to ask them what's important to them.
We're here for the cow. She's giving us all the profits we need to maintain these facilities and buildings and employees. Man, let's take care of her.
Roadway, I'd call it more as a roundabout. And it's kind of like a weird analogy where we're, as farmers, farming and raising these livestock up, and then themselves are kind of have their own, herd of microbes in their gut that they're raising up.
I have two great passions in my life. The one is people, and the second is cows. And I want to get the best out of them.
Welcome to AK Podcast, where we explore science and nutrition behind livestock care and management with the best of the brightest in the business. I'm your host, Chris Radke, part of the sales department here at Agri-King. And with me today is the Director of Field Services and a member of the sales and marketing team, Mr. Mike Donaldson. Mike, how you doing, buddy?
Outstanding, Chris. After a good start this week, why don't you kick us off?
All right, good. Hey, Mike, who are we talking about, or who are we talking with, and what are we talking about today?
Now, this would be a really good one, Chris. We have the third episode in our series on calves and heifers. We're joined by Dr. Adam Geiger, one of the field nutritionists for Agri-King, and has a very impressive resume that I'm going to suggest you go back to one of the first two episodes where Adam joined us, because I don't want to waste time repeating what he's already told you about himself. So welcome, Dr. Geiger. Welcome, Adam. And let's move into our next phase of taking care of calves. Pick it up from there, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. I think we've covered a lot of ground already, right? We even started before the calf was born. We spent a lot of time talking about the milk fed period and some of the risks and opportunities there. I started to touch on grain, and then we kind of teed this thing up right to dive into the weaning process, and we talked about that a little bit last time. But I think the lifetime impact on weaning a calf, whether you do it right or wrong, is so profound and so long-lived that it's worth spending a little bit of extra time diving into that, making sure we give it the time it deserves.
At what point, one of the things that's come up to me as we work through this, and I keep picking on kids whose job is to feed calves, but it seems like in a lot of cases where calves aren't maybe getting the attention that they ought to, that once they're started, I'm looking at a 35, 40-day-old calf, never had scours, never coughed once, everything's going really, really well. On a lot of farms, they start to get into almost a dangerous level of autopilot, don't they? We take it for granted everything's going good. We got this thing off to a great start. Wow, I did a great job with my colostrum management. Look how good this is all working. Only there's really no time to let up, and it certainly isn't going into weaning, is it?
Right. And, it's an interesting way to describe it as autopilot, because that's very true. And the other thing to keep in mind is the amount of things that we have learned, not just about feeding calves, but weaning them in that weaning transition. the amount of stuff we've learned, the amount of research we've gathered, the amount of data we now have, just say over the last 10 years, it's really phenomenal. We've really learned a lot on how to do this thing and do it right. As I think about it, right, you kind of alluded to it a little bit. That 35, 45 days, that's kind of maybe a little bit more of the way we used to do things, right? Is like, hey, we've got this calf through colostrum. We've been fed milk here for a few weeks. Milk is more expensive than grain. Let's try to get them onto grain as quick as we can, right? And then it's really autopilot from there, right? Because you're just putting out feed once a day. But as more data comes out, and we realize what it takes that, remembering this calf is born as a monogastric and is going to become a ruminant, right? If you think about that calf's stomach at birth, it's mostly abomasum for milk digestion. And we want to get it to be mostly rumen by the time it's on solid feed. In Mother Nature, that takes what? 6 months, right? And the data shows that calf is not probably a fully functioning ruminant maybe to 3 or 4 months if we do things absolutely correctly. And so we really have a really big risk if we push them off of milk too early and onto grain too early. And I think a lot of the data information that we've gathered in the last few years and a lot of the research is really starting to show that.
So, and as I've talked about what we're working with here and your concepts and ideas with some other people, this is an area where there's a lot of opinions, and I can find a lot of people that think what they're doing is perfect. And I hesitate to say it's an example of more than one way to be right. I think what's more accurate is there's more than one way to do it wrong. But what would your program be then as we're getting closer to weaning, even down to this starts to be almost an age-old discussion. Do I want grain or hay? What is it that's going to develop the rumen? I mean, that might be a generational fight, but there certainly is a lot of opinions on what I want to get into that calf to help with rumen development while she's still being milk fed.
That is a loaded question, my friend. I have given lectures at universities where what you just asked is essentially 2 separate classes. But so let me start by saying, yes, there are, and this is a phrase I stole from a good friend of mine, Dr. Judd Heinrichs at Penn State. And he's one of those guys that really did a lot of the foundational research on how early can we wean calves. There you go. And he always said, there's 1,000 ways to raise a calf. And as long as you keep that calf healthy, most, if not all of them will work and work well, right? But that comes down to, number one, how do we make the decision when to wean calves? Okay? There's 3 common schools of thought. In my opinion, 2 are wrong, 1 is right, and I think most people would agree with this. We are not weaning based off age. Right? A 45-day versus a 65-day-old calf, depending upon how you manage them, rumen development might not be any different, right? We're also not weaning off of body weight, right? I can get a pretty dang heavy calf by feeding it 2 gallons of milk a day, but it probably hasn't eaten any grain, and it's not ready to be weaned. We need to be weaning based off grain consumption and intake. Okay, so I want to see calves consuming at least 3 to 4 pounds of dry feed a day per day for 5 days in a row before we pull the milk. That tells me that they are able to consume enough solid feed, enough quantity to support them after the milk goes away. Some of the newer data that's come out from Dr. Jim Quigley and others, once a calf has consumed 15 kilos or 30, 35 pounds of NFC, it's consumed enough carbohydrates where its rumen's functioning properly, fermentation can carry on, VFA production can carry on, and that calf is ready to be weaned. So the number one mistake we can make is not, because every calf is different, right? Not giving some of those calves that maybe aren't quite where they need to be in terms of solid feed intake, maybe a little bit extra time to actually actually get to where they need to go. We can wean a calf pretty dang early, but then that doesn't mean that calf will be successful, after the milk goes away.
So, refresh, in case someone is just jumping into this, give a brief overview of what you wanted the grain to be at this point. What are some of the common ingredients you want to put into that grain?
Yeah, and you mentioned that, and I forgot to answer it for you just now. And that gets into, so you get into the dry feed, right? And that gets into the conversation of grain, and then you alluded to, hay and forage, right? And so that's where this thing all comes together, and that's where this answer to this question becomes quite complicated, right? Because there's a lot of different things that can be going on here that are going to influence whether or not we are including hay and when we introduce it, things like that. So I'm going to give you a bunch of information right now, and then we'll just see where it takes us. But number one, if we're going to wean a calf effectively, it's obviously got to be consuming grain, which means it has to be introduced to it from a young age. So I want to see whatever grain you have chosen to use, that you're offering it from day one. Okay. It may not seem like it, but calves are going to start to play around and consume some quantity of grain at around 1 to 2 weeks of life. You may not notice it, but it's that curiosity and that getting into it that's going to then help things take off later on. Okay.
Now, is that helped along with the inclusion of something like molasses to draw them by smell? Does the texture, a bigger piece, play a role in that? How does that affect their nosiness?
So, and that's where I was headed. But
sorry,
we do. No, you're good. We got to be careful with molasses, because I do see a number of formulas out there that include a lot of molasses. Okay. Somewhere around that 5% is typically a pretty good number to be at. Again, it depends on ingredients and time of year, things like that. But a lot of those flavors and different additives, they're more a people thing, because we open that bag or we get that delivery of bulk feed and it smells good for us. It makes us feel good. So yeah, there may be a small palatability aspect there for the animal, but what's more important is that we make sure that the feed is well balanced and that it doesn't contain a high number of fines. So that's where the presentation of it really becomes important, and our decision to or to not include molasses and how much becomes important, right? The question I get asked a lot is, okay, what's better, a complete pellet or texturized, right? And my preference is texturized, but is that what the calf prefers? Likely not, right? That's just a me thing. It's a people thing. I think it looks nice. But I feed a lot of complete pellets to calves that do really, really great. So I'm not knocking complete pellets at all. But the mill that we're getting it from has to be able to make a good pellet that is not resulting in a lot of fines. So if our texturized feed has a lot of fines, we need to look at, adding another screen step or something like that, or maybe adding a little bit more molasses. Or we also may need to look at the way that our corn is processed, for example. If our flaked corn is resulting in a lot of fines, we may need to get a different corn source, a different type of processed corn, or we may need to add another screen step there. So we can present feed to calves in a number of ways, but our biggest determining factor is going to be that we don't have too many fine particles showing up in the feed. And so when we start to think, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just agree. I'm just kind of nodding along here.
And so when we start to think about what that looks like, right, there's a lot of different ingredients we can use, right? So obviously we're going to have some protein in there. And again, this also changes whether we're using just a calf starter, if we're using a calf starter and a calf grower, if we're switching to that grower before weaning, if we're switching to that grower after weaning. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in this area as well. But when we're talking about protein, right, we're going to have some soy in there and some canola, for example. And we're probably looking at a protein level somewhere around that 20% or a little bit lower. that's going to be enough for that calf to grow and put on frame. But the one thing we can't forget, and this is where that conversation around forage that you kind of alluded to starts to come into play, is our fiber and our starch. That ratio and that relationship, that's where a weaning transition and good calf health and growth can really be won or lost, in my opinion. So that gets complicated as well, because it depends on your grain source, depends on your fiber source. And sometimes I'm guilty of using the terms fiber and forage interchangeably, right? But calves have a fiber requirement, right? And so the decision to potentially include forage is going to depend what the fiber and starch level are in the calf grain that you're feeding and the starch source, right? So predominantly the number one starch source that we're going to use, in the US here is corn, right? And processed corn, right? But you're going to get oats, you're going to get some wheat, and you're going to get some barley, right? These are all different things that are being used out there. In terms of fiber source, you could be getting cottonseed hulls, whole cottonseed, beet pulp shreds, different types of hay, things like that. And so if you're using corn, for example, or let's take a step back, I want to see starch somewhere in the low to mid 30s. There's a lot of data out there and a lot of calf grains in the US where starch is at 40%. I think that's just way too high, because what you see is these calves get a lot of slug-like feeding bouts where they go for the grain, they get scours, so then they're looking for forage. And that, if you are dealing with a calf starter on your farm that is that high, it then may make sense to include some hay, right? But I don't like to do free choice hay, because if you've got that high starch grain, the calf's going to chow down on that, going to get some acidosis, upset stomach, chow down on your forage. Oh, I'm feeling good now. I'm going to go chow down on this. And it's just kind of this never-ending cycle. So if we're dealing with a situation where we have a starch level higher than what I typically like to see, I'd recommend getting a fine chopped, 1 inch, 2 inch hay, and mixing it in at 5 to 10% of your calf starter. And that's going to help make sure we meet the calf's fiber requirement and balance out that starch. So I like to see starch in that low 30s. And then the other two numbers I'm looking at are ADF and NDF. I like to see that NDF somewhere around 23 to 25%, maybe a little bit lower than that. That's going to be what's going to help with our rumen buffering, saliva production to help prevent any acidosis potentially associated with the starch intake from causing problems. And that ADF is going to be really nice. It's going to help us kind of get some nice fill to those calves without overfilling them, give them a nice bloom and capacity that's going to be better down the line. And I like to see that number, maybe around 11 to 12%. Now, this is where, and before you and I were joking around talking about how this thing is a little bit more of an art than a science, and this is kind of where it gets tricky, right? Is, okay, well, what if I'm using barley? A lot of barley. Well, barley's trade fermentable in the rumen, so now we might be looking at upping the amount of hay we add. What if we're using oats? Oats pulls in some bulk. Maybe we can dial back some of that hay if that's something that we're doing. So, there's a lot of ways to look at this, and it really depends on what you're using, what the calves are telling you, what their feces looks like around weaning and shortly after weaning. It really can be an individualized approach, but my preference is to give them whatever you're going to give them in a complete diet, right? So don't give a free choice of a bunch of different things, right? And don't make too many changes at once, right?
So no, please go ahead.
No. Go ahead. I've rambled, so I think it's time for me to.
So, no, you were breathing. Everything was going fine. We had it covered. So, the difference, maybe in my mind, is a farm in a position to create that calf pellet TMR that they want everything. I mean, everything we talk about TMR for a milking cow, one bite, all their nutrients, no sorting. That's all holding true. If you're in maybe the situation with a smaller farm, maybe 100 or 200 animals, maybe 100 or 200 calves, where you might be more prone to accept whatever the mill has floor stocked, that would then put a much higher premium on your calf feeder's ability to watch and monitor each calf, because you won't be able to completely get away from some degree of slug feeding. But can you come close enough if you're good enough?
That's a great question. So, number one, if we're dealing with a feed where we kind of maybe have to just accept a bagged feed or something that is available to us, we always do have the ability to potentially hand mix in like a fiber source or something on farm. But that's where the weaning process becomes super important. Making sure that our guys and gals on the farm are well dialed in, right? And again, this weaning process depends on how much milk we are feeding, but the last thing we want to do in that situation is try to take the weaning process too fast, right? Because then that's just going to amplify that slug feeding behavior and really increase the risk of acidosis that can harm that gut lining and really delay the ability of these animals to just the weaning slump, right? And so one way we can look at that, and one way that me and my partner Cameron have been looking at it really closely, is by looking at taking fecal samples, in the week or two after weaning, and seeing what the fecal starch levels are. You can even look at VFA profile too, but fecal starch is a great way to look at it, right? A normal calf is going to have a fecal starch prior to weaning, somewhere around that 2%. Typically, when we start to pull some of the milk away, and they're starting to eat more grain, but there's still some milk there, we might see that number increase to 3 or 4%. But then a week or two after weaning, if we've weaned them correctly, that fecal starch should still kind of remain in that sub 5% range. If we've done it poorly, I've seen it shoot up to 8%, sometimes even double digits, right? And so that means that we just didn't get enough feed intake, enough rumen development to get these calves properly transitioned over. And then that's when we may have to look at making some management changes if the feed's kind of static, right? Maybe we've got to slow things down, change the amount of milk we're feeding, things like that. And then that's where the art comes in a bit.
Well, we're going to wind up with an 8-hour podcast if I keep dragging you through every possibility and what about Timothy hay and what about alfalfa hay and Let's go back and take your preferred all-in-one grain, fiber, starch, protein, ADF, NDF. That's right. We've talked about what we're going to be feeding. Can you walk us through the weaning process on an individual calf that has however you're keeping score, she has now qualified through her dry grain consumption to be weaned. So now what are you going to be doing?
Yep. So if we go back to one of the previous episodes where I talked about kind of my ideal feeding program, and I use that carefully so I don't get in trouble and get held to it. But I think the example we used there was we were feeding 8 quarts a day. And so if we just continue on with that, all right, what I'm going to do in that situation, because we're at 8 quarts, is I'm going to recommend a 2-step weaning process. Okay. 2 step downs. And in this scenario, my first step is going to be from 8 quarts a day down to 4 quarts. So you will
cut it in half as a first step.
As a first step. Yep.
Okay.
Now that depends on if we're feeding more than that, we probably wouldn't cut it in half. it depends on, again, the farm and the management, how good those calves are eating. If they're not eating much grain and they're smaller herd sized animals, body weight, we need to be very careful with that because they might not be eating much solid feed. But my goal is for calves to be consuming at least 4 quarts of milk for 60 to 70 days. So on this program, say we're at the 8 quarts, we're going to take them out to 56, 60 days, somewhere in there. We're going to take half of it away. And that's what's going to send the message to the calf that the grain's gone away. But then we're still going to keep them on milk. I want to see them on the 2 and 2 for 7 days. And then after 7 days, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take away one of those feedings. So then we're just down to 2. Okay. And, on some farms, we instead of going from 8 to 4, we might go from 8 to 6 if they're already eating decent amounts of grain. In some, we might go from 4, and just remove a feeding and only go down to 3 instead of 2. So there's some art there depending upon what our goals and objectives are for that particular herd. Where it gets really interesting is if we start to look at programs with auto feeders, right? Those guys with the automatic calf feeders, they can dial it in, very tightly. We can have a 14-day reduction. But in those scenarios, that's where I like to do it, where I have that much control. I like to take that first step and I like to do like a 25 to 35% reduction, like immediately. Right? Because if you do that over a 14-day period, it's going to be a very slow reduction over time. And some calves aren't going to notice that the milk has gone away until pretty far into that weaning process. Whereas if we can send a clear signal to those calves by doing that 25 to 35% reduction right away and then slowly reduce it, those calves, we see a really nice grain intake curve. And
how do you want to see water consumption through this time as far as, quality speaks for itself. It's got to be good. But what about the quantity? If you're able to, I'm thinking in an individual calf hutch, what do you want to see from that standpoint to know that things are going well?
Well, you just need to keep in mind that it's a 4-to-1 relationship, right? So for every 1 pound of 1 pound of grain the calves eat, they're going to consume at least 4 pounds of water. So if we're getting through this weaning process and those calves are going to be consuming 4 to 5 pounds of grain minimum, probably more than that, quadruple it. And that's how much water they're going to need. So having ample and adequate amounts of fresh, clean water that during certain times of the year is not frozen becomes really important. So I think it's instead of more water intake targets, we have feed intake targets, and we just know that grain or that water intake is going to stay pretty much in that 4-to-1 relationship with it.
But so then the important thing would be, if I'm doing the math right in my head, we're talking about 2 gallons of water a day with the amount of grain you were talking about in that example. So it becomes our responsibility as the feeder to be sure we've offered at least 2 gallons of water available. I know it's freezing right now. That's going to be hard to do, but that is something to pay attention to and not just limp by with, 2 quarts twice a day or something, that you're filling buckets or putting enough in to have that kind of water available.
Yeah. And that might mean, if they're not, after weaning, it becomes a lot easier when they're group housed, right? Because you're going to have typically, that's self-regulated, self-filling. But that means we might be filling buckets more than once.
Yeah. No, well, and I guess I'd never really thought of that relationship. Now I'm just being curious. So you're all of a sudden back home. Instead of being in Georgia, you're outside Green Bay again. What management things can you throw into this that today in 10-degree weather, I've got a chance to get that much water into them before it freezes in a calf hutch situation?
Yeah, I think one of the first things we've got to do is we've got to fill the water immediately after milk, because a lot of times they will still be up and eating and they'll drink then. But then it's coming through and topping off waters throughout the day. There's no, on a large operation, there's no silver bullet for it. On a smaller operation, we could buy, some of those like heated ropes or heated tapes from Lowe's or Tractor Supply or something like that. Those do a good job of helping us keep those buckets from freezing. But you might be talking about coming through, filling waters, coming and dumping them out before they freeze, getting calves up later in the day, filling them again, but always making sure that you provide fresh water after milk feeding is key, because they will drink, and the calves like a routine. So if you always do that, they know the water's coming then, and they'll come in and they'll drink a pretty good slug of water at that point as well.
Well, I suppose the relatively short-term nature that a calf is a calf means that we don't have to worry about one that was born in August learning this system. It's one born in November or December that you've got to do this extra. She's learned a different routine than the July calves had to learn.
Right. Yep. Yep. Thankfully, it's only seasonal.
So you've got us to the point we've stepped down. We're stepping down milk on the day that you take all milk away. What are you going to feed her, and when are you going to start to make any changes to that?
Yep. I want to see her remain on that same feed that she was getting the day she was weaned for at least 14 more days before we make any changes, right? And I don't want to see you vaccinating her on weaning. I don't want to see you moving her to a new location at weaning. I don't want to see you grouping her at weaning, right? Let her be herself with that feed, right? Now, more and more, I'm moving to a one grain system, right? Where we don't have a starter and grower. We just have essentially a starter. And what we'll do is keep them on that for about 3 weeks. And then after 3 weeks after the milk goes away, and then we'll start to increase the amount of hay that we are feeding mixed in with that to increase that fiber and forage content. So I want to see them on that same grain for at least 14 days before we make any changes. And I want to see them in the same environment, same pen for at least 7 days, right? So a lot of times what we'll get, and again, this changes depending upon how many calvings you have, how quickly you need to move calves through the system, right? Sometimes years are heavier for guys than others. But so what we're going to want to do, what I typically see is, okay, they'll pull the milk away, 7 days, those calves are alone in a hutch, and then they might move them to a group, but keep them on that same grain for another, 7 days or so, and then start to, so they've been moved and grouped, and then 7 days later, they'll start to make dietary modifications. And obviously then, the longer you go out from the weaning process, right, our feed efficiency is decreasing, our growth rate is decreasing because they're not consuming milk. And so at that point, it really starts to become about hitting our key body weight objectives without getting them too fat. And, the interesting thing then, or the thing we got to keep in mind, right, is that the further out we get from that weaning process, the less protein they're going to need, the less starch they're going to need, and the more fiber is going to start to become, I would say, our friend, or maybe a tool that we can use, right? Because I think it's pretty clear to all of us, right, that as this animal is getting older, forage is becoming a bigger part of her diet, right? And there's obviously that risk that if you incorporate too much forage too soon, right, you're not going to get enough NFC intake, you're not going to get enough rumen development, right? But this is where things get interesting, right, is because now we're really concerned with hitting our body weight goals for really until she calves in for the first time and then beyond. But that's where fiber becomes our friend, because it's about body weight gain, it's about frame gain, but it's also about making sure that we're not getting these calves and heifers too fat, right? So we have to monitor body condition. So we're going to start increasing the forage content, right? We kind of already talked about that. After about 21 days following weaning, we can really then start to increase the amount of forage we're adding, and eventually we're going to get them over onto a TMR. Now, this is something you and I talked about before as well, right? There's a lot of research going on right now about how soon we can do that. I really caution anybody from pushing that before really that kind of 6-month range. You get a little earlier than that, but just because she's probably not ready for it yet. And also some of those TMRs can be a little rich, right? And so we can really see condition take off on us. And I'm kind of dancing around all of this as it relates to the conversation of puberty and cycling and insemination. I think I've shared this with you. I'm actually a physiologist by training, right? So a lot of what my work has revolved around is when we're feeding her and she's putting on weight, how's that impacting what's going on inside her body? Well, I don't know if you know this or not, but puberty is almost exclusively determined by one thing: body weight. When she hits 45% of her mature body weight, she's going to start cycling. And we're typically going to try to breed her around 55%, with the ultimate goal of getting her to calve in at, the number changes based off the research, but 87, 89% of her mature body weight. So that brings up a couple of things. Number one, we do ultimately need to be making breeding decisions based off of body weight. But how many of your guys know the mature body weight of their herd?
Yeah. Until you tell them to go back and look at the call cow numbers, they haven't got a clue.
Exactly. So we're making a decision on a number that's based off of another number that we may or may not know. So that's issue number one. Number two is, and this is where a lot of the work that I did kind of came into play. And if you remember, we talked about in early life, if you can get them to grow faster, the mammary gland will grow faster too, and they'll produce more milk in first lactation. Well, there's a really important window of mammary growth that also occurs after weaning. Okay? It is from weaning until she begins cycling, right? So from weaning until puberty. So the other thing we've got to be careful of is if we grow her too fast after weaning, she might put on, number one, too much weight, and she might get fatty udder. But number two, we're going to push her through that important period of mammary growth too fast. And we actually see then that she's going to hit puberty potentially earlier. And those animals that grow too fast from weaning until puberty actually end up producing less milk in first lactation. So you could have gotten everything right in the first 60 to 90 days, but then if you screw it up afterwards, you can lose everything you gained or even go backwards. And that's because we get a lot of guys that, number one, they kind of stop paying attention to them after they're weaning because they're like, oh, they're on solid feed autopilot time. Or we just, quite frankly, we don't know what we're doing because it's a very poorly researched area of raising cattle. And we just grow them too fast and we push them through that period too much. They get too chunky. And we don't realize it until it's too late.
Is this where, and it's starting to be a long time ago, I understand, but is this where some consideration of stature, not just body weight, started to become an important parameter to watch?
Yeah, so we definitely want to breed, and the stature requirements are going to vary based off breed and obviously how large of a herd you have. But yes, typically we're wanting to look at making sure that we get animals that are the right body weight and that have enough frame to support, a pregnancy, and all while not getting them too fat. Because those animals that get fat, they're going to be compromised in terms of first lactation milk yield. They are going to have more difficulties with the calving process, and they are not going to they're not going to be as likely to maintain that pregnancy. And that's where. Okay.
No, please go ahead.
But that's where this concept of how we grow these animals, right? Starting to incorporate more forage, using fiber as our friend, because I don't think I said it yet, but a calf can only consume 1% of its body weight as NDF, right? So if we're seeing that these animals are getting too chunky and too carried away on us, chunky is a very scientific term, I realize. If they're getting too over-conditioned and getting away from us, that's where we can start to selectively use forage to control our intakes by understanding that they're only going to consume 1% of their body weight as NDF. But if the diet's too rich, too hot of a TMR, lactating cow refusals, right? That's where we might push them through that period too fast, and get them going on through their journey earlier than they're ready to be.
I think in a lot of instances, one area that larger herds, and we won't worry about what larger is, just the concept, a larger herd is sometimes easier to have more specific diets because it's easier to have a group big enough to treat as a standalone group. So if you were to go from what's the least number of actual different rations you'd like to have to 10,000 cow herd that I can give them a slightly different ration every 6 weeks if you tell me to, Adam. What take me from 100 cow herd that might not have the ability to do as many groups. How many rations would you actually put their heifers on through until their breeding size?
Yeah, I don't know that I can truly answer that. It depends what your facilities are and how many different pens you have. But, I think we are obviously starting with our grain diet that they'll be weaned on that likely has some sort of fiber in it. And then after they're weaned, 3 weeks or so, then we're going to see the forage inclusion increase. And then it depends on your facilities and how many pens you have. I think back to the farm that I grew up on. We had a separate facility. We milked 70 cows. We had a separate facility where we were breeding our animals at, and so they were weaned, and then they had a diet in that weaning pen afterwards, and then they probably had another 2 diets before they were bred. So I don't think there's a set number, though. Obviously, you can be more dialed in and more specific. The larger your groups are, the larger your farm is. But I think it's just important that, above all, we use the animal's body condition and body size to tell us if we need to try to incorporate another step in there, and while also making sure that we have a handle on our mature body weight if we don't, because then that can tell us if we're getting someplace too fast or not fast enough.
So what, in the real world, what do you see people doing to accurately monitor something like body weight? I understand drawing a chalk mark on a wall can give you an idea of stature. I mean, and we talk too much about ideal worlds when nobody lives in one, but would you design a facility that they ran across scales the way a feedlot checks their animals? What do you like to do to actually monitor that body weight?
Yeah, and so that's what even just if you're taking animals around on trailer and you're getting trailer weights, hey, I'm good with that. Trailer weight's better than nothing, So that depends on when we are moving animals and things like that. Yeah, certainly. I've got some large farms that I work with. I've got a couple that come to mind actually in Mexico that they put a scale out in the run pens and they weigh them every month. Right. So that's extreme, right? Those guys got more data than I know what to do with, which is a good problem to have. Right. But I think at the bare minimum, we need a birth weight, obviously. We need a weaning weight, which typically ends up becoming a hutch exit weight because that's when they're being handled, which I'm cool with. And then like an insemination weight. So if we have those, and then we can also get a mature body weight, which let's call our 3-year-old weights, after they've calved in. I think that's a really good place for us to start.
Okay. Well,
so
we wanted to.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say we wanted to take today's episode up to breeding, up to time we're going to inseminate these animals. We're real close to that, or we're on top of it. What are your I hate to say final observations, but put a cap on this phase that you've worked us through, either the most important things or maybe something you haven't mentioned yet, and I interrupted you.
No, you're good. I think, and this one's a little more chaotic than some of the other ones because there's so much going on, and it depends so much on the facilities, the management style, what we have available to us, and it truly is more an art than a science. But I'm going to take it back to a quote that we said earlier, right? There's a lot of ways to raise calves and heifers, and as long as you keep them healthy, most, if not all, will be successful. And this health aspect, I think, is what becomes really important. Because number one, animals that are, even if they're just stuck with a needle, doesn't matter how severe or what for, they're going to produce less milk in first lactation. Okay. But they're also not going to be as likely to get pregnant, or the time at which we can delay them will ultimately that we can breed them, will ultimately get delayed because body weight gain and health will be compromised. And I think this is going to tee us up really nicely then for our next discussion, because when I'm talking about post-weaned heifers, I have what I like to call the big 3 diseases that I keep an eye out for. Okay. Number 1, respiratory disease, right? I mean, I think we can all agree that's our most common disease in our post-weaned heifers, right? That animal, if she gets stuck with a needle for respiratory disease, doesn't matter on severity, you can kiss 500 pounds milk in first lactation goodbye and 25 accumulated days off her lifetime productive life. So, I mean, there's an impact there. And so monitoring the environment, having good air movement, proper bedding management, right? Making sure that the ammonia levels in the environment, like we talked about previously, aren't getting carried away on us. That becomes really, really important. Number 2, lameness. Okay. We tend to not think about lameness in our younger calves and heifers. I have a lot of guys I work with that will trim cows prior to calving in for the first time. But what I'm really talking about is digital dermatitis or hairy heel warts, because I've seen calves 6 months old with them. Heifers are super susceptible to it. Yeah, heifers are super susceptible to hairy heel warts, because what's difference between how heifers and cows are managed? Heifers are typically still on bedding. So they're like straw bedding or shavings or something like that. So they've got a lot of manure and debris matted to the back of their feet that can allow those pathogens to grow.
Mm-hmm.
They're also urinating and defecating more than smaller animals. So that bedding is a lot nastier than what we see with the younger animals. A lot of times they're in retrofitted facilities where the air quality or airflow maybe isn't so good, so that ammonia level is going to be super high, and it's going to break down the skin and allow those pathogens to take hold. And we can't typically run them through a foot bath, so we don't have any way to prevent the warts. So that's one that I really, really focus on. That might be a whole separate conversation for another podcast even, is this conversation of hairy heel warts in calves and heifers, because I've seen some pens where 90% of the heifers at 6 months of age have had warts. So
really?
something to think about, and it's a headache for guys. And then the last one, which I think we'll really dive into a bit more next time, so maybe this teases us up for next time, is mastitis. Heifers can get mastitis a lot earlier than we think. Could be a cross-suckling thing, could be from, contamination in the environment, you name it. But animals that calve in ultimately with mastitis, even if it's just subclinical, are going to produce significantly less milk in first lactation. So we got to keep those animals clean, those animals healthy, so that they're not calving in, compromised, and we're not kissing all of our hard work goodbye.
No, those are three things you certainly want to avoid. That's a good list.
Loaded.
Yeah. And I like the idea of maybe an entirely separate podcast on maybe rounded up to hoof health in heifers, especially before breeding, but even after. Because if there's a time, and we'll come to that in the next episode, but if there's ever a time that heifers next get forgotten is once they're checked pregnant. and then they seem to sort of go off to camp somewhere and just supposed to show back up later. So
Black box number 2.
there you are. Well, Adam, I appreciate so much. I find these discussions, I'm going back and reviewing them, and I hope our listeners are also finding them to be very helpful. Chris, what did you learn today?
I had to use my 3 times of weaning, and Adam said only one of them. One was we don't wean because of age. And the other one was you don't wean because of body weight. And the other one is that he recommends is off or when they're on grain. And hey, Adam, can you repeat the numbers? I have like 35 kilos, but then I remember you said like a percentage of something.
Yeah, so I like to see typically 3 kilos of feed 5 days in a row. So that's going to be 5 to 6 pounds, 5 days in a row, a little over 6 pounds before we take the feed away completely. So not when you start the milk reduction, but before the milk comes away completely. Or 15 kgs of NFC intake total. So you've accumulated 15 kgs of NFC intake over that milk fed stage. Not sure what the percent one I would have said was. That one doesn't ring a bell. So
go back and listen to it later. Cool. All right. If you thank you very much, Adam. If you liked what you heard, you can find us on just about any of our socials. You can leave us a review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to us on, and you can find us on our website now. I think we're at the bottom. And if you have any questions or comments or follow-ups with Adam, you can hit us up at an email at podcast@agriking.com. All right, Adam, Mike, thank you very much for your time.
Appreciate you guys. Thank you.
thank you.